I need to share a personal decision that has been weighing heavily on my mind for many months now. This was not a snap judgment. It was not born out of anger, fear, or any desire for attention. And it certainly was not made for the superficial reasons some commentators will immediately assume. Instead, this choice lays bare a much larger and far more troubling reality about the direction the United States has taken in recent years. If you still believe that speaking the truth openly is one of the most important duties of citizenship, please drop a comment below and simply write "Truth still matters." If you are willing to hear the full story, why this step became the only responsible option left, what it really means for anyone who still cares about the founding principles of this country and how everyday Americans can still turn things around, then here is the complete picture of what I have witnessed firsthand step by step and why those observations finally forced me into a decision I never imagined I would have to make. For more than 30 years I have been an entrepreneur in the truest sense. I have founded companies from scratch, taken them public, created tens of thousands of high-paying American jobs, paid hundreds of millions in taxes, and worked relentlessly to keep the United States the undisputed global leader in technology and innovation. I still believe with every fiber of my being in the classic American promise that if you work hard, think creatively, take calculated risks, and persist through failure, you can build something extraordinary that improves millions of lives and strengthens the entire nation. That belief is why I stayed in the fight for so long. But starting roughly 6 or 7 years ago, I began noticing changes that went far beyond normal political swings. These were deeper, structural shifts in the basic rules of how truth is handled in this country. Public conversation stopped being about competing ideas and started being about personal destruction of anyone who stepped outside an increasingly narrow band of acceptable opinion. Principles that Americans on both sides had defended for generations: free speech, due process, evidence-based debate, the presumption that good faith disagreement is healthy, were suddenly treated as optional the moment they became inconvenient for whichever side held temporary power. I watched in real time as questioning certain official narratives, no matter how calmly or with how much evidence, was reclassified from legitimate inquiry to dangerous extremism almost overnight. This is not a partisan statement. I have voted for candidates from both parties in my life. What I am describing cuts across left and right. It is about the slow but unmistakable erosion of the single most important American idea, that truth is discovered through open, uncoerced debate, not enforced by institutions, corporations, or mobs. The real breaking point for me came during and after the 2024 election cycle. Perfectly reasonable questions about election integrity, about the origins and handling of public health policy, about coordinated content removal on social media, and about expanding government surveillance powers were met not with data, transparency, or counter-argument, but with immediate, highly organized efforts to silence, deplatform, discredit, and financially ruin anyone who asked them. I personally possessed documents, data sets, and internal communications that directly contradicted several high-profile public claims. The moment I even considered making any of that information public, multiple advisors, lawyers, board members, longtime investors warned me that the backlash would be swift and existential, not just against me but against every employee, every vendor, every university research partnership, and every government contract my companies held. In other words, speak verifiable truth and watch thousands of innocent American livelihoods be deliberately destroyed as collateral damage. That is not theoretical. Watched it happen to colleagues, to scientists, to journalists, to doctors, to professors, to small business owners who dared only to ask questions. Bank accounts frozen, insurance policies canceled, children harassed at school, families doxxed, careers ended with a single coordinated media blast. When truth-telling carries that level of personal and professional risk, and when silence is the only way to protect the people who depend on you, something foundational in the society has already cracked. Because of the scale of my companies, I had unusual visibility into how the suppression actually worked. We are talking about scheduled bi-weekly calls between senior federal officials and the trust and safety teams of the largest platforms, complete with shared spreadsheets listing specific accounts, hashtags, and entire topics to be throttled or removed. We are talking about payment processors and cloud providers suddenly discovering policy violations, the day after a controversial post. We are talking about advertising networks that would pull every dollar from a site the moment it published an interview with the wrong expert. We are talking about academic journals retracting peer-reviewed papers. Not because the data was wrong, but because the conclusions were politically inconvenient. And we are talking about all of this happening without a single new law being passed, simply through the quiet alignment of incentives among a handful of the most powerful institutions on earth. I saw universities, places that are supposed to exist for the sole purpose of pursuing truth wherever it leads, fire tenured professors for citing peer-reviewed studies that contradicted the approved line. I saw medical boards threaten to revoke licenses of physicians who prescribed decades-old, FDA-approved drugs in new ways that later proved life-saving. I saw journalists who exposed government overreach lose their jobs, their health insurance, and in some cases their freedom of movement because of sudden legal harassment. I saw crowds of people who claimed to hate bullying cheer as families were driven from their homes for holding the wrong opinion. And perhaps most disturbing of all, I saw how eagerly average citizens participated. People who in any other context would call themselves kind, compassionate, and progressive would share hit-piece articles, celebrate deplatformings, and even call the employers of total strangers, all because the target had violated the new orthodoxy on one topic. They appeared completely unable to see that the machinery they were cheering for today could be aimed at them tomorrow. After watching this pattern repeat for several years, I reached a point of clarity, remaining physically and financially inside the United States while trying to speak honestly had become incompatible with my responsibility to the thousands of American families who depend on my companies for their paychecks. The constant need to self-censor every public statement, to run every tweet through layers of legal review, to maintain a full-time team just to handle incoming threats and cancellation attempts, that was no longer a sustainable way to lead innovative organizations. The energy required to defend my basic right to think independently was greater than the energy left over to actually invent, build, and employ. So I made the hardest professional decision of my life. I temporarily relocate my primary residence and a portion of my operations to a jurisdiction that still fully protects open inquiry and free expression. This is not permanent exile. It is not abandoning America. My companies remain headquartered in the United States. They still pay the vast majority of their taxes here. They still employ the overwhelming majority of their workers here. I still spend a great deal of time in the country. But I needed enough breathing room to be able to speak plainly about what I have seen without triggering immediate economic warfare against innocent employees. Think of it like a fighter who steps out of a burning building in order to organize a more effective response instead of being trapped inside and burned alive. Distance does not equal surrender. Sometimes distance is the only way to gain the perspective and safety required to actually help. Let me give you a concrete example of someone who faced an almost identical dilemma under very different historical circumstances. Her name is Maria, and she is now 72 years old. She grew up in Eastern Europe under a communist government in the 1950s and early 1960s. As a young woman, she watched neighbors disappear because they asked the wrong question at the wrong meeting. She watched teachers lose their jobs for assigning the wrong book. She watched the slow, almost imperceptible tightening of what could be said in public until one day the entire society woke up in a cage none of them had voted for. In 1965, at great personal risk, Maria escaped and made it to the United States with almost nothing. For the next 5 decades, she built a beautiful American life, raised a family, started a small business, paid taxes, volunteered at her church, became a proud citizen. She genuinely believed she had found the one place on earth where truth was genuinely protected. Then, starting about 5 or 6 years ago, she began telling me, through tears, that she was seeing the same patterns all over again. Not the tanks in the streets, not the midnight arrests, something far more sophisticated and therefore far more dangerous. She saw topics suddenly become unspeakable. She saw people encouraged to report family members and co-workers for private opinions. She saw institutions that had spent her entire adult life defending freedom quietly pivot to enforcing conformity. She saw young people who had never lived under real repression cheer for the debanking and deplatforming of dissenters because those dissenters were on the wrong side. The ideology is different, she told me one afternoon, but the psychology is exactly the same. When a Society becomes more afraid of uncomfortable truth than of comfortable lies. The label on the system stops mattering. The result is always control. Maria explained the most dangerous moment is always the one we are in right now, when the restrictions are still framed as temporary, reasonable, and necessary to protect democracy, public health, or social justice. That is the moment when good people convince themselves that just this once it is acceptable to punish thought crimes. What? That precedent is set, there is no logical stopping point. The definition of harm simply keeps expanding until it swallows everything. She lived through the entire arc, from the first common-sense speech codes that 80% of the population supported, to the professional blacklists, to the show trials, to the eventual total control of information. And she watched it all happen inside institutions that still called themselves universities, newspapers, courts, and academies of science. That conversation with Maria crystallized everything for me. What we are living through is not just another swing of the political pendulum. It is the early stage of a coordinated capture of the knowledge-producing and truth-distributing institutions of the United States by a new ideological orthodoxy that no longer tolerates dissent. Once I accepted that reality, the decision became unavoidable. Staying inside the pressure cooker while trying to speak honestly was no longer responsible leadership. Moving my primary base of operations to a freer jurisdiction was the only way to continue defending American ideals without becoming yet another cautionary tale that silences the next person. From this new vantage point, I can now say things plainly that would have been career suicide 6 months ago. I can publish data without fear that my employees' 401(k)s will be targeted. I can fund research and journalism without triggering immediate regulatory retaliation against unrelated business units. I can host conferences, support whistleblowers, and build parallel systems that preserve open inquiry while the legacy systems are still captured. And perhaps most importantly, I can encourage the millions of Americans who quietly agree but are too afraid to speak to understand that they are not alone, that history shows these periods do pass, and that strategic, principled resistance works. Because here is the part so many people miss. This fight is ultimately winnable. Other Western democracies have gone through almost identical crises. Canada in the 2010s, the UK with its speech arrests, Australia with its COVID-era controls, Germany with its NetzDG law, and in every case the backlash eventually came because enough ordinary citizens finally said enough. The key is that the resistance must come from people who refuse to play the new rules of the game. People who keep speaking truth in their workplaces even when HR sends the memo. People who keep asking questions at school board meetings even when labeled conspiracy theorists. People who financially support canceled creators even when PayPal makes it difficult. People who refuse to shun their neighbor over politics. People who understand that defending free speech means defending it for everyone, even the people you most despise. And that responsibility falls especially heavily on Americans who are past the stage of life where career cancellation is an existential threat. If you are retired or semi-retired or financially independent, if you no longer have a boss who can fire you for wrongthink, then you now have more freedom to speak than any generation before you in history. Your historical memory is priceless right now. You have seen ideologies come and go. You remember when universities debated ideas instead of banning them. You remember when newspapers corrected errors instead of memory-holing stories. You remember when Americans could disagree without hating each other. Your calm, experienced voices are the single greatest asset the cause of truth has right now. When a 70-year-old engineer who helped land men on the moon says, "This policy will not work," people should listen. When an 80-year-old pediatric nurse says, "I have never seen this pattern of injury before," the room should go silent. When a retired history professor says, "This is how it started the last time," we dismiss her at our peril. Yet today those voices are the most systematically marginalized. They are called old, out of touch, privileged, anything to avoid engaging with the substance of what they are saying. That devaluation of lived experience is not accidental. It is a deliberate tactic to clear the field for radical experimentation without the inconvenience of historical perspective. So my temporary relocation is not the story. It is a symptom. The real story is that millions of good Americans currently feel they cannot speak honestly without destroying their lives or the lives of people who depend on them. That is not the America any of us signed up for. but it is also not permanent. Cultures can change direction faster than most people imagine. Once a critical mass decides, the cost of silence has become higher than the cost of speech. And that critical mass is forming right now, in private text threats, in church basements, at kitchen tables, in small business owners who quietly route around the captured systems, in parents who refuse to let schools indoctrinate their children, in investors who move capital toward platforms that still believe in free expression. The question is no longer whether the current system of soft totalitarianism can be built. It largely has been. The question is whether enough Americans still possess the courage and clarity to dismantle it peacefully through parallel institutions, relentless truth-telling, and unbreakable principle. My hope is that by stepping outside the blast radius for a time, I can help accelerate that process instead of becoming another silent statistic. My commitment is that every resource I have will be used to preserve the conditions under which innovation, truth-seeking, and genuine human flourishing can happen again inside the United States. Because make no mistake, America is still the greatest engine of progress the world has ever known. People are still the most creative, generous, and resilient on Earth. All we have lost, for now, is the temporary capture of a few key choke points of information and finance. Those can be rebuilt. They are being rebuilt as we speak. What cannot be rebuilt if we lose it is the cultural habit of free inquiry itself. Once a society forgets how to tolerate disagreement, how to change its mind in the face of evidence, how to treat opponents as fellow citizens rather than enemies, recovery becomes almost impossible. So this is my appeal to every American listening, especially those of you with gray hair and decades of perspective. Your country needs you now more than it ever needed you when you were 30 and climbing the ladder. You no longer have to worry about being fired. You have already built your life. You have seen empires rise and fall, fads come and go, moral panics burn themselves out. You know in your bones that truth wins in the end, but only if enough people are willing to carry the torch. While it is unpopular, speak in your families. Speak in your clubs and churches and veteran halls. Write the letter to the editor. Call into the radio show. Support the canceled professor. Hire the young person who was blacklisted for one wrong tweet. Start the alternative institution. Fund the parallel platform. Refuse to comply with the new speech codes even when it costs you friends. That is how free societies are won back, person by person, conversation by conversation, act of quiet courage by act of quiet courage. I did not want to leave, even temporarily, but I realized staying silent inside the machine was no longer moral option. If my small act of relocation helps even a few thousand more Americans find their own voice, it will have been worth it 1,000 times over. Because the America worth fighting for is not gone. It is waiting, just on the other side of enough people deciding that truth is more important than comfort, principle is more important than popularity, and freedom is more important than fear. Share this with one person who needs to hear that they are not crazy for noticing what is happening. Subscribe if you are ready to be part of the solution instead of part of the silence. And in the comments, tell me one truth you have been holding back, and why today might be the day to finally say it out loud. Because the future of this country will not be decided by billionaires or politicians. Will be decided by ordinary Americans who decide that some things are more important than being like. Thank you for listening to the full story. The best chapters are still ahead, if we write them together.